When we talked about scope, I said that I thought it was a better idea to have smaller projects that were more achievable versus these giant behemoths of a thing. And I think that's because it's a very natural human tendency to obviously like to achieve a thing. There's the whole thing about dopamine rewards. And I just think we get bored of things that go on for a very long time. And it's just nicer to have that sense of achievement. And in addition to that, there are some jobs that are simply too big to be called a single project. So here's what we do to split them up. Here's a nice example from our own system. When we started to record the workshop, we didn't have this pattern yet. And the thing about this is when you do something like this, you often don't know how big it's going to be until you see how big it's going to be. You get halfway through and you think, geez, this thing's really outgrown an ID, but by now we've got all this video in here and it's too hard to change. So that's another nice advantage of the work packages, and I think is one of the reasons we tend to lean on them we go there pretty quickly these days, because we understand they are a nice granular place to work, and they mean that you don't have to think about how big a thing's going to be, because it's just as big as a work package. By the time we had finished this, it was quite neat. This was the original ID that you can then see I've moved elsewhere, but we had the structure of the thing all laid out, and we had this idea of templates in here so that everything kind of looks the same, but hopefully you'll get the idea, right? There's a massive structure. In fact, if I just expand everything here, look at all this stuff in here, right? This is far, 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 far too much to be in a single ID, and work packages solve this problem very neatly. Here's something else to consider is now that workshop folder ended up being something like 0.5 terabyte of video images, which is really unmanageable when you've got one folder, as I've now learned. One single folder, which is 0.5 terabyte, isn't a very nice thing for someone like me, a systems administrator who has to consider which things are on which laptops and moving things around. It's not a very nice thing to manage. It's far nicer to have more folders with fewer things in them. It's just a much nicer thing to administer. And also, as we then found, these videos inside here no longer have an ID of their own. Everything is 2132. And so what if, when I'm talking to Lucy, I want to refer to a specific video? And in fact, I only just thought about this. In fact, to compensate for that, what we ended up doing was building an entire database in Airtable where I tracked each thing that we shot and scenes and its status. And interestingly, now that we are using work packages for this course, we do not use that Airtable database. We have no need for it, because the granularity of the work packages really have completely taken away all of those problems that we had. So yes, when we did the workshop, the first iteration of this work package thing was a thing we called the creative pattern. And that was this recognition that every creative output that you have, every creative job that you do, deserves its own ID and it deserves its own space. We realized pretty quickly that there would obviously be more than 100 of those, so they don't neatly fit into the standard area categories and then 100 IDs, and so they need their own numbering system. It needs its own space. So then work packages are just a natural evolution of that and a kind of obvious conclusion. And what we've done is taken the idea of a creative job and just turned that into any piece of work that you do. And you might be thinking a common objection when people see this is, well, isn't this just what my Johnny.Decimal IDs are? Aren't Johnny.Decimal IDs just these jobs that I'm doing? And the answer is yes, they completely can be. You do not have to use this if you don't want to. This is if you want to expand that and if you want to break out, and like we'll see with things like the workshop where you kind of have to sometimes because things are too big. But if you have an ID that does the job, like my 2114 Learn Japanese, and you don't need to use work packages, then you don't need to do that. Just a point of order, in an earlier video I said that an ID isn't a project, and what I was referring to there was the static. So in Life Admin, ID 1182, Hobbies and Learning, isn't a project because it's obviously too broad for that. What I meant there was that those Life Admin style IDs, and also see the small business system, the stuff at 10319, they've designed to be very broad. 1114 licenses, really broad, not a project. Whereas now, once I'm into 2114 Learn Japanese, that can be a project, because now we're into the more traditional Johnny.Decimal style of ID where I am inventing IDs for things as I go, and therefore they are a lot more granular. 2114 Learn Japanese is a lot more granular than 1182, hobbies and learning. Here's a little example I thought of for where this is completely context dependent and where you might use them and when you might not in the same scenario. So imagine two pizza shops. First pizza shop is old classic Gino's, right? And old Gino's been around since 1908 and is famous for never changing their menu. That's one of the things about him. You go in and it's the same old place every day, day in, day out. Margarita every day, right? Gino hasn't changed his menu in forever, and so their menu will be stored in the small business system at category 21 products. So let's just call it 2111 menu. And Gino can get away with putting their menu in 2111, and every year they might update it to bump the prices up $1 or whatever, but there's not a lot going on there. Gino probably doesn't need to use work packages to manage his menu. Now, same sort of business, different shape. Let's imagine that hipster pizza joint down the end of your street, right? It's called East Coast or something, and they've got pizzas that change every week. You've got ostrich and craft brew on a pizza or some other horrible nonsense. That menu changes constantly. They're always on Instagram, they're reprinting it, they're sticking it on the wall. It should be obvious for that sort of pizza shop where the menu changes literally sometimes every day, right? Because they're getting all the fresh ingredients from the market and blah, blah, blah. You do not want to manage the menu in 2111 menu. And in that situation, here's where work packages would be really handy, because 2111 remains the canonical home for the menu. We'll see in a bit, you always need an ID as the home. But then every new menu, every week, and every Instagram shoot and every new series of pictures for the menu that gets printed and potentially working out the menu, right? They might do the actual menu work in the work package. What's fresh at the market? What do we want to put on the pizza? What's a good price? That happens in a work package. And now, what do we call it? Yeast Coast. Yeast Coast is free to spin off as many menus as they possibly want over time, because who knows how many menus they're going to make, and it doesn't matter. Each one is a work package with the concept of menu 2111 as their overall owner at the top. And so now back in objection world, you might be thinking, well, isn't that what a category is for? And it could be. It could work if East Coast wanted to make a new category, 65, whatever, let's invent a number and call it the menu, and then 65, 11, 12, 13 could be the menu each week. They could do that. You are limited by 100. What happens when you get to 100? You've used up a category now. Also, I think my main objection to this is that if somebody looks for the menu in the small business system, it's in products, and then you're going to find 2111 menu, and then you don't know there's this whole other category somewhere else. So you could do that. But again, we've tended to find, after having used this in our business now for a long time, that the work package solution is just neater and actually, as it turns out, more obvious. All right, that's the setup. So this one isn't too long. Let's cut there and I'll show you the detail of the numbers in the next video.